Okay, in the interest of time, let's get started here. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today on the second of what is our Masterclass series. I'm going to be covering the topic of cleaning up the BI mess, and hopefully giving you a roadmap to how you might think about this in your organization. I'm Mike Smitherman. I look after sales and marketing over here at Metric Insights. Have Marius Moscovici on again with me today. Hi, Marius.
Hi, Mike. Glad to be doing this again.
Usual housekeeping stuff, so everyone is on mute given the large crowd, but happy to take questions and discussion in the Q&A and chat window as we go through this. We'll leave some time at the end to answer questions. We are recording, so we'll send a link out afterwards, but this will always be available on our YouTube channel, Metric Insights, along with the other sessions as we do them. So the previous one on AI, if you didn't attend that, that's available up there, and obviously the future ones we have 4 or 5 more of these through the end of the year. So with that, I think that's all, Marius. So I'll hand over to you to kick off, and we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to talk a little bit about governance today and obviously cleaning up the mess, but it starts with governance. And I want to make a point to start off that, really, if you talk to any data governance team, if you talk to data governance team in your organization, odds are, everyone talks a pretty good game, right? They'll tell you that, well, yeah, we have really good data governance. We've identified where our PII data is. We've identified data sensitivity across all our tables. We've maybe even come up with a glossary where we ended up defining a lot of our key terms. All that is in a data catalog, and a data governance tool, perhaps. Maybe they have Elation or Calibra or Atlan or some tool like that. It's all there. It's accessible to all the analysts, so anyone can come in and really take advantage of all this information. It all looks really good on the surface, and those things that are said may very well be true, but in reality, it's not really as good as it seems, right? And the reason for that comes to this sort of truth that is almost self-evident, but when you unpack it and you look at what how people actually implement governance in your organization, I'll stipulate to you that it is in fact not really well thought through and understood. And that's that data governance is not really about governing data, right? It's about governing how people's use of data, right? Your data is not, you're not worried about your data getting up and leaving, right? Or it's sitting up on the drive somewhere in an enterprise data warehouse, probably encrypted. What you're worried about is misuse of that data, whether it's by a malicious party or oftentimes, more often the case, by somebody who is not aware of the fact that they're misusing the data. They have a report which has internal classified information or PI information, and they're sharing that in a way that's inappropriate. They're downloading information they should not be, things of that nature, or they're misusing that information from a governance perspective in a way where they're just applying it in the wrong way. They don't really understand what the particular metric means, and therefore they're misapplying it. So it's really all about how have you governed the consumption of that information by your end consumers of the information of that information, right? Like that lens is how you need to be thinking about governance rather than just have I captured the metadata about the data, and have I checked the boxes there, right? So that's the key thing. And it's this idea that, what you want to make sure if you're going to have proper governance is that three things are happening, that everyone in the organization, irrespective of who they are, right, is consuming the right data. In other words, they're not going to just any data source. They're going to the data source that is certified, that has the right information for them. If they're using a report to consume the data, they're looking at the right report that is using the correct certified data source, right? So that entire thread of information is kind of being preserved, right? And that way they're interpreting it correctly, that they have the context when they're looking at the data. So what I mean by that is if I'm looking at a report and it has sales information, well, how is sales defined in context of that particular report. And how, do I understand that so I don't misinterpret that information and go make a decision that's incorrect based on the fact that I assumed the report was saying X and it's actually saying Y, right? And that may be very different from what's underneath in the table, et cetera, because there might be semantic transformation of that information in the report itself if I'm consuming it. Right? So I want to be able to understand the context when I'm consuming it. And then, of course, it needs to be in compliance with the security policies. So that means that, of course, I don't have access to data that I shouldn't through the report, but also I'm more importantly, a more nuanced perspective is to also realize that I know what the data classification is on that report, so that and how I should be using that data. I know if this is restricted data that maybe, and I'm a privileged person in the organization, I know I can't share this because this is restricted. If it's confidential internal use only, I know I can't share this with other partners unless because it's not cannot be disclosed outside the organization. And then even if it's within the organization, if it has PII information, I know to be very careful about where downloading it and doing things with it that are going to could potentially cause issues or go awry of policies that we have within the organization, right? And so that's really ultimately, if you think about it, this should be and ought to be and intuitively really is the only goal that makes sense from a governance perspective. But oftentimes these things are actually very much divorced from what the data governance team is doing on a day-to-day basis, because these things are just in a data catalog somewhere that maybe a handful of people are using, may be accessible to lots of folks, but it's not within the regular workflow of data consumers. So therefore, they're not really doing these things when they're consuming the information, right? And so, we have to recognize when we talk about, how do we get to a really well-governed, clean environment. I think we have to recognize that today's data governance efforts in general, if you were to look across almost all organizations, are largely half measures, right? They start the process. They do potentially a good job at just doing data governance itself, but they do a very poor job at governing how people are consuming that information. And it's really impossible to get effective overall governance if you're only governing the data, right? If you ignore the fact that 95, 99% of your consumers of the information are getting that data through BI tools, through AI agents, through other consumption layers, right? Then Excel spreadsheets that are published out there. They're getting their information through layers. They're not going to the data catalog and your data governance tool to get the information there about what they're looking at. So, unless you come to terms with that in a foundational way, and that's a sort of a first sort of layer that you need to do. And unless you do that, you can't really get started. But if you understand that, if you realize the fact that you've got to clean the whole, you've got to really look at the consumption layer, then you can really begin the process of cleaning up the mess that's there, right? And before we kind of go through that, right, cleaning up the mess, let's talk a little bit about why there is a mess in more organizations on the BI layer, right? And what happens is that you have a situation where over time in any large organization, often there's thousands, in some organizations we've seen many tens of thousands of reporting objects that develop out there. When you count both the traditional reporting objects, Power BI, Tableau, etc., as well as the conversational analytics things that are published today, the even older sort of Excel feeds, and sometimes people have SAS feeds and things like that people have available. There's just so many objects out there, and then oftentimes those things are created by a large community of users so it's a federated sort of development effort. So people are not necessarily aware what each other are creating. And people move around within the organization, and sometimes some institutional knowledge gets lost. An analyst leaves, a new one comes in. They don't realize the new analyst doesn't realize the old analyst already created something, and they create something new that is very adjacent to what already exists. So over time, invariably, a mess will develop, right? You'll have a situation where a large percentage of all the assets that you have in your organization are become either duplicates or they're unused content, and you need to be able to clean that up. And so this masterclass really is going to be focusing largely on that process. We're going to drill down into that and say, no, how do you do that? How do you clean up the process? And then what do you do once it's clean? How do you keep it clean? Right? Because I think all of you on the call have probably been involved in some kind of a one-time spring cleaning. Let's go in out there and try to clean up the process. And I think you've all seen that that doesn't work, right? That you can't. Maybe you go do a big effort, you clean up a bunch of stuff, and then it builds up again. And so, what's the process by which you can initially do that cleanup in an effective way and then keep everything clean? And we're going to really, deep dive into that and discuss that in detail. Show you some examples of how that works in practice, so that you can then hopefully take those and apply those to your environment. So let's start with that. So looking at the roadmap to kind of cleaning up the environment, the first step is really to take an inventory of what you have, right? You've got to look at all the different BI tools that you have, and you need to connect to the metadata that's underneath these tools, and you need to generate kind of an overall inventory of everything that's there, right? That's table stakes. You can't clean up what you don't if you don't know the full extent of what's there. And that has to happen if you have Power BI and Tableau and Click and a bunch of stuff on SharePoint, then all those things have to be pulled together from all those sources to make that work. Right. So that's step one. And to do that, you've got to, when we talk about the metadata, right, we're talking about a few things. There's kind of the core report metadata, things like the name, the description of reports, tags that might be on that report, right? But it needs to go further than that because, you are not necessarily going to be able to tell the report is a duplicate because by looking at just names, because you and I might have created a very, very much of an overlapping report, but I named it one thing, you named it something else. So you've got to start looking at the report column metadata as well. In other words, what are the columns of data that are fed to the user by the report? Right? That's because that's one clue. If you and I both created reports with sales by product, by country, by category or something like that, well, if a lot of those columns overlap, there's a good reason to think that maybe there's an overlap in those reports. So that's important. But then even beyond that, we've got to dig deeper and you've got to look at the report lineage. What I mean by that is, what are the tables and columns that this particular report is accessing? Because if we have two reports and they have a significant the matching set of report columns, that's a good indicator, a significant overlap there. If they also have a significant overlap in where those columns are coming from, then that is an even stronger indicator that there's potential overlap. Right? So that's important as well. And then you want to look at distribution details. Who's consuming it? Is it the same set of users or a different set of users? That's important because obviously if it's completely disjoint communities, that gives you a clue that maybe the two communities are not even aware of the fact that that report exists. Right? And maybe there's some reports that are consumed more than others. So report usage is also a very important detail that you need in order to be able to understand how to consolidate these reports. So you need to inventory that up front. So if you have a report that's unused, and it overlaps with another report, well, you can pretty much just get rid of it. Maybe it's just cruft out there that you want to make sure nobody stumbles into by mistake. If there's two reports, there's a lot of overlap, and they have also a lot of usage, that's a much more difficult thing. You need to really analyze and figure out, well, can those be merged? How do we make sure that we support the needs of both organizations and just have a single object so that over time there isn't a bifurcation where there's multiple sources of truth with different numbers. So all of this has to be collected as part of a metadata extraction process in order to get started in the rationalization effort for your reporting ecosystem to make sure now that you've really cleaned it up and have a good pristine environment. So let's assume you've done that. You've scanned your existing metadata from all the tools that you're using. You've brought that information in. Then the next thing you want to do is you want to go through a process that identifies the obsolete and unused reports, right? So anything that is not getting usage, getting zero usage or getting sort of nominal usage, where it's people just sort of stumbling into it, looking at it and saying, well, okay, this is useless and moving on, right? Those are things that should just immediately be removed, right? And that's the first step. Once you've done that, and that can be done manually, but it can also be done in an automated fashion, right? You can archive those things so that if somebody yells and said, no, I actually need it, you can come back and get to that object. But you can just get rid of things if they fall below a minimal usage threshold. And oftentimes, by the way, in an organization, this will remove 20, 30, 40% of the content, right? So it's a massive pruning that occurs out of that. And then the next step is then now I've got to uncover potential duplicate reports. So of the remaining things that are being used, what are the potential duplicates? Looking at the metadata, identifying, doing clustering analysis, figuring out what are the report clusters that appear like they have a significant overlap. How do I do that and then figure out what our potential duplicates are? And to do that, right, I've got to look at a few things. So I've got to look at overlap in column names and data types, right? That's one signal. I'm looking at overlap in report lineage, like we talked about, right? So both the tables and columns that are referenced by the report and the core report metadata. So the column metadata and the core report metadata. So core report metadata would be like tags and names. The report column metadata is going to be like what are the names of all the columns that are inside of the report that are being shared with the users, right? And I'm going to look at all that, and I'm going to create clusters of reports that then identify potential duplicates. I use basic statistical clustering analyses to do that, and with that, now I can identify what do I want to delete, what do I want to consolidate. Which I can say, well, I can see there's a high level of overlap here. I can see based on the usage of those reports who's using them. I can engage those stakeholders where appropriate, or look at the analysts that are involved. Probably a discussion is needed, right, to make sure we understand what can be removed. You look at the report itself, and then you can consolidate and create a single asset, right? And that's the key thing. So I've kind of described the whole process here, but now let me hand it over to Mike, and he'll show you kind of in real life, like what does this mean? I'll give you some examples because I think visualizing this is much easier to understand.
Yeah, thanks, Marius. So let me jump into the Metric Insights platform here and show you how we're dealing with this and those different layers that Marius spoke about in terms of the actual implementation. So I have a instance of Metric Insights running here. It's connected out to both Power BI and Tableau in this case, as we'll use for examples here. And it starts with that metadata collection that Marius mentioned. So what we have in Metric Insights is the concept of what we call plugins or connectors, which does that automatically. So a plugin in this case to Tableau. We're reaching out to our Tableau server. We're authenticating our plugin against that server so that it can go out and start to track the workbooks and worksheets that are getting created or have been created on, in this case, the instance of Tableau that we have deployed in our environment. So as part of this metadata collection, not only are we getting the workbooks and the worksheets with the basic core reporting metadata that Marius spoke about, we're also picking up the report columns. We're picking up the lineage of where those reports are built on. So this is showing, our inventory overview workbook is being sourced from a number of tables in our underlying database here. So lineage, report columns, core metadata is what we're capturing, along with the other piece that Marius mentioned, which is usage of these assets and who has access to them. So you got to figure out a way of capturing that metadata in a scalable way. We do it in Metric Insights through this concept of plugins. So whether you're looking at Tableau, whether you're looking at Power BI, plugs into your instance, brings back the objects that are available on there along with their corresponding metadata. Once we have that, we can start looking at the details of what's going on. And we do that through our optimizer layer here. So what you're looking at here is those two instances of Power BI and Tableau that we've connected to within our plugins. if I expand these, what you're actually looking at is the organizational paradigm of each of these systems. Excuse me. So in Power BI, our workspaces and folders, in Tableau, our sites and projects that we're connecting to. And yeah, I've got some filters up the top as well. But initially, what I'm interested in doing is tidying up the unused and obsolete content that Marius spoke about. So we're tracking that, we're tracking usage. And what you're looking at here is if I go to, say, a particular Tableau project, um, you're seeing effectively what we've determined are unused or little used content within that particular project. So this is content that's had little to no usage over the last 90 days. And I'm able to see some context around what that is. So, who's the owner of that content, who created it, when was it last used, who did last look at it, has it been updated at all? And then sort of the quote unquote distribution piece of it, who actually has access to it, even though they're not looking at it. So it gives me, I can drill into this and see which users and which user groups have been assigned access to this particular report. So I've got some context around, the scope that it was expected to serve, even though it's got no usage. So I can scan through all this information. I can look at it, and filter out by things. Maybe I want to ignore things that just haven't been used in the last week and look longer. So I can get an idea of kind of what's going on here and ultimately start to work through cleaning up the obsolete content that we're seeing. And again, that's the same across, Power BI, for example. Same idea. I see the usage and who's looking at what. So step one, collect the metadata. Step two, start to work my way through unused and obsolete content, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about how you can sort of distribute that across the teams. I can always drill through and view these reports as well to see them and take a closer look at them. But again, it gives me an idea there. I can then move on to looking at these clusters of potentially overlapping and duplicative content. So, obviously it's if there's direct copies of things, then that's fairly easy to identify. But what we're really looking at here is where there's similar reports. They might not be exact copies, but they're close enough that it's worth putting some effort into trying to rationalize and combine them together. And so again, what we're doing here is looking at the metadata that we're capturing, but rather than focusing in on the usage, if I pick Tableau again as an example here, I drill into this, let's exclude the unused reports here from this. You'll start to see that I start to get these reports tagged as main or similar. So what is that? Well, if I click on something like this sales analysis report, which has been deemed a sort of main report here, I drag this up here. What this is identifying is a cluster of similar reports. Reports that have in the column here a particularly high overlap score, and we'll talk about how this is being calculated, but a high overlap score in terms of similarity. Um, and they're comparing these reports to the main report here. The main report has been identified initially based on the level of usage it's got over a particular time period. So in this case, we're looking at 90-day usage. The sales analysis report is the most used. And when we compare these reports to a sales analysis report, they have this high overlapping score. Now, I could go in and if I have some knowledge about these reports and I know actually it's this one that is the one that I'm expecting people to use primarily, I could designate that as the main report and start comparing things against that. But for now, let's assume this is the one that we're expecting people to use, and there's these sort of rogue reports out there that look very similar. So I can see the usage. I can see again who created them, who potentially has access to them, but I can start to delve deeper. So I can say, okay, well, let's focus on this overall sales analysis and let's compare it against that main sales analysis report and try and see what's going on here. And so as I drill into this, it starts by looking at the report column metadata that we've been referencing. So these are the columns in this case, the Tableau workbooks that are being used in our worksheets and our charts to analyze the data by. Um, Obviously, if it's a tick, it's I'm using that column. So, in this case, I can see that there's 100% overlap between both reports. They're both using what looks like the same sales data by channel, country within here, and there's 100% overlap in terms of what's being put in place there. If we move down, there's also the lineage component. So which table or tables in the underlying warehouse are feeding those data report columns and the models and data sources in this case within Tableau that we're using. And again, I can see that they're both based on this particular database table. Oops. Um, and they're both pulling in the same columns from that underlying database table to feed their reports. And then finally, I get down to the metadata overlap, the general report metadata. This is looking at names and descriptions and tags, and the only real difference in this is a slight difference in the naming of the report. Yeah, I can drill further and confirm that and look at things like the lineage and where each report is coming from and perhaps where it's being used in the organization. So I can drill into it. It's looking like, though, that this is likely either a duplicate report in this case, which it appears to be, or a very similar report that I might want to look at. And I can go in and then take a look at those reports side by side. So this is now going to render both reports directly from Tableau. And sure enough, when I look at it, they seem to be effectively the same report. Looks like this one has been published without the tab showing. This one has the tab showing, but effectively they're the same report. Looks like someone took a copy of this and it's hanging out there. So what happens when I find something like this? Well, typically then we want to push it into some sort of workflow where I could assign this then to perhaps the owner or someone to take care of, take a look at it. I feel like this needs review. Let's assign it to someone, make a comment, take a look, let me know your thoughts. Is this something that we can archive? So a basic workflow to take care of it. If I determined actually it's something we need, and even though it's pretty similar, we are using it and we need it, I would remove that from the report cluster so it doesn't keep popping up and I don't have to worry about it again. So working through the process here of identifying things and tidying them up. Um, how do we sort of do that in reality when we have probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of assets out there? Typically it is not one person working through this stuff. So, this we would layer on our permissions model so that I'm really focusing on stuff that I'm responsible for in my area or just particular reports that I'm responsible for. So this view would typically only show things focusing me in on similar reports that I'm responsible for and I own. Um, we also utilize our distribution engine around this as well. So for those that have looked at metric insights in the past, and we'll get into this maybe if we have time towards the end, we were able to send out information to users, and we can utilize that here. So maybe rather than looking at that screen every day and trying to track what's going on, when we do identify unused or underutilized reports or potential duplicates that are owned by a user, let's send those clusters out to them and make them aware of it, and they can log in and then take care of that stuff. So plug into the sources, connect and collect the metadata, look for obsolete content, identify potential clusters of duplicates or overlapping content, have workflows to tidy that stuff up, and ultimately archive it if it's not useful anymore, and make sure you're doing that in a scalable way where different users are responsible for their content. You pass it back to you here, Marius.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. It's good to see that in action. So let me get this right here. Okay, so let's say you've done that, right? Whether you've used Metric Insights or you've implemented all that on your own, you've done that and you've cleaned up cleaned up the initial mess, right? You've kind of rationalized what you have in there. So what happens after that, right? Because I think that's the beginning of the journey, not the end of the journey, right? And I think that the way to think about this is that then you go into from initial cleanup into ongoing maintenance. So during the ongoing maintenance phase, you're going to monitor usage and flag unused reports for review. There's no reason to let hundreds of these things build up over time. You can, as soon as a report has, let's say, 90 days go by and it has either zero or close to zero usage, you can notify the report owner for that for manual reduction, or we have many of our customers that just will automatically purge those, move them into an archived area. And then, if there's a reason why they need to come back, you can always go back to them and to that archived area and bring it on, right? So kind of just either an automated or manual way, remove them from the system, right? So that's a easy, straightforward way to keep that clean. And then similarly, with the kind of notification that Mike showed, we're monitoring on an ongoing basis, continuously run the clustering analysis. If there's a new potential duplicate report showing up with significant similarity, you don't need to wait for somebody to come in and discover that. No, you send that to the person who is responsible for that report, either the owner of the main report or the owner of the duplicate report, potential duplicate report, or both. And you flag those things. And in fact, this can be a very useful way to avoid lots of wasted effort, right? Because you can imagine if I publish a new report to Power BI or Tableau, and I'm still working on it, and the system detects that that's duplicate, even before I'm finished, I ought to be notified. And that way I can save myself from doing a bunch of work, because I can realize, oh, wait, Joe over there in that other department already created something. I didn't have access to it, but I can request access from Joe. Let me take a look at it. Well, that looks really good as a starting point. Let me save myself a bunch of time, use that report instead, and then avoid a whole duplicate from being introduced into the system, right? So that's to my users, right? So that's a very powerful kind of just-in-time mechanism that you want to be able to do to optimize the way that your team works while reducing duplicates. And then you want to have a process by which new reports kind of get published into the system, into a governed space for consumption based on a publishing workflow, right? You don't want it shouldn't be the case that a good governance is not anybody publishes anything that then can be used by everyone in the organization or a select group within the organization. No, it should go through a process by which you are vetting that to make sure so that somebody's looked, that it's not a potential duplicate, that it meets the key governance requirements from a consumption perspective. Remember, I mentioned that you want to be able to know, like, what kind of, does this have PII data? What's the data classification? Who are the owners? All this key governance information. You don't want it just locked away in your data governance tool. You want that stuff bubbled up to the point of report consumption. And to do that, you need to have a governed space to publish the content, but you also need to have a workflow such that the content is not automatically pushed, but rather goes through a gated governance process, and we ensure that it meets the minimum standards for publishing. So we'll show you in a bit what that means, but I think that that's a really key distinction from a consumption layer. And then you want to have ongoing report on the rationalization workflow. So if something it goes into a process of duplicate detection, somebody looks at it and it's not moving anywhere, you want to have some kind kind of mechanism for escalation, reminding that person about, hey, this is in your queue, you haven't done anything about it, and eventually reminding somebody in the COE or in management to say, look, this item has been flagged for resolution, and there's been no action taken, so that you're forcing a discipline of, just a few minutes a day potentially, or a week even, if there's not a lot of duplicates. But somebody should be spending time on the things that are assigned to them, if they have a potential duplicate, and either doing something to resolve the duplicate, or identifying that, hey, it's not a duplicate, like Mike showed, explaining why it is, and then moving on, right? But having that happen, and then having this cycle kind of continue on an ongoing basis, so that your environment gets cleaned up and then stays clean as you move forward, through time, rather than building up a whole bunch of cruft again. So, with that, let me switch over to Mike, and he can kind of show you what that ongoing process looks like, as well as what is like an example of a governed space through which users can consume that information once it's published.
Yeah, thanks, Maris. So, yeah, the one thing Maris mentioned there at the beginning was this idea of sort of flagging potential duplicates as they're happening. Yeah, again, as picking up this metadata, if there's someone working on a Tableau report, and we're tracking the metadata of what's being created there, typically that's happening over a period of time. If we see something, and we see an overlap, we can message that person. So, in this case, we found an overlap between the Tableau report and something that's in Power BI, and it looks very similar, from a metadata perspective. Let's notify the owner or owners of those reports, and let them know what's going on there. And again, try and stop it before it gets out there or they spend too much time on it. But let's move on to kind of the publishing effort. So again, what we're talking about here is then having a sort of governed space to access BI in the organization and organize BI in the organization. And we'll get to looking at that governed space in a minute. But what we want to put in place is some sort of onboarding and workflow effort where when new content gets created, and we've determined that it is something that we want to make available to our users, that we're onboarding that into a space in an appropriate way, that it's had the necessary checks and balances and the necessary metadata attached to it, so that when users access it in that governed space, that they know they can trust the data and trust the report that they're looking at. And we do that in Metric Insights through this concept of what we call publishing workflows. A publishing workflow is a set of steps or stages that content gets assigned to. Depending on the content and the audience, that dictates the level of scrutiny or governance that a report will get. So these can be customized in terms of the number of steps and who's involved. But the idea is, let's say, in this case, we're publishing financial reports. These are highly scrutinized because they're going out to the board or the street, and we want to make sure that they're absolutely correct and have the necessary context around them. When a new report gets created, it will be assigned to a queue where it's pending review. And in this case, we have three stakeholders who are going to be involved with the publishing of this report. The developer is going to get his or her hands on it to look at it. Maybe the VP of Finance or the CFO is going to take a look at it. Maybe the governance team is going to have the final say on whether it's ready for prime time. But essentially, it will go through these stages, through these swim lanes. At each stage, the user can come in and, if I'm responsible for a particular step, I'll just see that step here and those reports in that step. I may be responsible for reviewing them. I may be responsible for attaching additional metadata that we can't maybe capture automatically. So maybe I'm responsible for tagging it better or something like that. But ultimately, it's going to get a level of certification when it's been through the process. In this case, a gold standard, because it's been through a very rigorous process of multiple stakeholders. Other reports maybe it's our departmental reports, they're just going out to our team. Maybe it is just the developer who's reviewing that and making it available. Maybe we give that a lower level of certification to recognize that. But ultimately, again, it's been through a process and it's getting published for end users to look at. So you want to think about the onboarding process. You want to think about, who needs to be involved based on the content that you're publishing. You don't want to overgovern for governance sake, but you want to make sure that a report has the necessary checks and balances before it's made available to end users. You also want to make sure that you're revisiting the set of published content on a regular basis. So when a report gets through this process and made available to end users, maybe after a particular time frame that's appropriate, every 3 or 6 months, you want to flag that for review, so that the owner or someone responsible for it, has to attest that it is still useful and something we want to keep and not something that's become obsolete that we maybe want to remove. So you want to be able to factor that into the workflow, have this sort of attestation or review stage where things come back into the mix after a period of time. So when we talk about publishing stuff somewhere, what do we mean by that? In the metric insights world, we mean a sort of centralized catalog, a portal where anything that has been through that process can be published in a single space so that users have one place to come and access that. And that's through our catalog in metric insights, where each of these tiles that you're looking at here is an asset that has been published. It's been through the workflow process. It's been certified and made available to end users. And now they have one place to come and access content, whether it's Tableau, Power BI, spreadsheets on SharePoint, with the necessary context that you've added to it. So, in this case, when I preview this particular report in Tableau, I've got the names, the descriptions. I've picked up glossary terms from our data catalog in terms of what metrics are involved in this report and how they calculated and who owns those definitions and what other reports have been published that contain those metrics. I've got the lineage of where the data is coming from in this particular report, and any other classification that might have been set that's important to me. Does it contain PII data? Is it for internal use only? So when I access this report, and in this case we embed it and we sign the user in, I know that this is a trusted piece of content that has been vetted, that I need to that I can use, and I know how to use it and what it means in our organization and how I should be interpreting the data. So having a way to publish certified content into a single space with metadata is key then to keeping that governed set of content under control. We mentioned the attestation stage, the review stage. When something comes up for review, how do I know whether it is still useful? Maybe it hasn't popped up in the obsolete bucket. It hasn't shown up in the duplicative clusters that we're creating, but the sales analysis has been out there for a while and it's come up for review. Well, you also want to make sure that as a report owner, I can track both engagement with the content. So, it is still getting some usage now and again, although it does seem to have dropped off recently over the period of time. So, what was a very useful report back then, now, we're getting what looks like weekly usage of it. So, may still be relevant to users. You can also capture feedback, or you should have a mechanism for capturing feedback on the reports from users who have access to it. So maybe having sort of a website type thing that you see which prompts users for feedback or ratings on the report, where they can periodically give their input if they're looking at it or suggest improvements, whatever it might be. So that again, when something comes up for review, not only can I see is it being used, but why or what is the feedback that I'm getting on that? Is it something that I need to keep? Is it something that I need to update? Is it something that it looks like users are migrating over to another report to get this information, and very soon this is going to become obsolete. So that helps me decide what to do with it. So um, collect collect the metadata, tidy up the environment, push what you have left through publishing workflows and governance workflows into a centralized governed space with the necessary metadata and context that users can trust it. Keep track of the environment. Make sure you're continually revisiting the cleanup effort. Using the notifications capability that you put in place so that you're keeping the environment clean. Make sure you're continually reviewing the content that's out there so that you're not cluttering the environment with obsolete content, and that you're making a sort of delightful experience for end users in terms of accessing that. So with that, let's jump across, and I saw some questions popping up, Marius. So let's take a look at the Q&A that we have here. Bringing up the window. Topical question from Frank coming in here, Marius. So how is AI affecting BI? Are all these legacy tools still relevant? Do we need to use the new ones? I guess that's a huge topic in itself, but you want to comment?
That's right. That's a big
Yeah,
topic.
yeah,
I think we talked, there was this prior webinar, and I saw Zoe is going to be sending, Frank, the webinar on that, which we did, or ma first series of this masterclass specifically on AI for BI. So we encourage you to look at that. But just at a high level, our belief is that it's not that AI is making all these dashboards go away. Those of us that have been around in the industry for a while have know about, can remember the transition that took place from the old I'm going to use do all my analysis in Excel to BI tools, and all the BI tools did not displace Excel, much to the chagrin of most of us BI practitioners that would love for it to go away. Those things are still there. It's just people are still using Excel, and they're also using the BI tools. And for a number of reasons, we believe that with AI, there's going to be a lot of adoption in AI for BI and conversational analytics. And if folks are going to definitely be making use of those to understand, especially a lot of why questions that are very difficult to answer when you look at dashboards today. But they're going to be complementary to dashboards in the sense you're not an organization is not going to get rid of everything they have. They're still very much of a place for those things where you can look at a dashboard and get an answer quickly versus have to have a conversation to answer that. You can really see those use cases that will make sense. At the same time, there are going to be lots of new use cases, lots of even existing use cases that do get solved better with conversational analytics. And so we'll have a follow-up masterclass discussion, I think probably later in the year, where we really delve into this topic in more depth as to how do you really engineer and think about an AI for BI strategy that really aligns well with your existing assets and kind of think through an effective strategy there. So there will be more on that when we get later into the sequence of masterclass topics. But for now, just stop there as
yeah.
just general commentary.
Yeah, thanks. Just answer Steve's question here quick. Publicly available list of plugins. It is on our website. You can also go to help.metricinsights.com, where there's more in-depth sort of documentation and lists there as well. Yeah, I will say on our plugin architecture, we have a large library of plugins that we work with. We are also, building new plugins as new tools and technologies become available, assuming those tools have the necessary APIs for us to work with. So, the list is exhaustive for a point in time, but it's also rapidly growing as well. Uh, what is the rate of accuracy finding duplication using metadata and your approaches and tools? Yeah. You want to talk to that, Maris? I've got
Yeah,
some
so
thoughts, but
it's
yeah.
it's not that's a great question, and
Mm,
I think there's not like a absolute measure of accuracy in the way that you can think of it like traditionally, in the sense that these are clusters if you think of them as like with similarity, and so you know Of course, you can 100% detect a 100% duplicate, right? But that isn't that's really not a realistic real life scenario. What's happening in real life is kind of the example that Mike posited, where somebody takes an existing report, makes a copy, and then builds and extends it in some way. Or another scenario is, two developers, unbeknownst to each other, build the same report at some point over time, or similar reports. They're not going to be exactly the same, right? Because they're building, so there are going to be some differences in columns in the report. There are going to be some differences potentially in lineage. There maybe some the metadata. So it's not going to be at 100% overlap. So the way to think about that is that there's a kind of a dial that we provide that you turn up and you determine, what is the threshold at which similar reports get grouped into a cluster? Is it 70%, 80%, 90%? You can set that dial. And then what you're doing when you turn that dial is you're creating one of two things. You're either generating more detection of potential duplicates, but at the cost of having some false positives in that list that then you're going to look at and say, no, these are really, yes, there's overlap in metadata, but in fact, there's a good reason why we need both reports. So let me take it out of the cluster, and they're not duplicates. You're trading that off for the volume of potential matches that you're finding. So typically what you want to do is you want to run through that algorithm, you want to see what you generate, and then you kind of turn up that dial of saying what's the right threshold, and then run it again, kind of evaluate it, and then figure out for your organization what's the right balance, right? As far as like the risk of generating some false positives that you have to dismiss versus the risk of missing out on some key duplicates, and setting it at the right sweet spot threshold. And the key is, once you've dismissed something out of a cluster, it will not appear again, right? So if I've said report A is not is not really the same as report B, it's not going to show up in the same cluster as report B going forward, because the system is learning over time based on the feedback you've given it by removing it out of the system, that there's actually exceptions that it needs to ignore from a clustering analysis.
There's a question here. I think this came up when you were going through the steps on the slide, so the lead time for different steps in the process. I think it's probably related to sort of just the practical rollout of a program like this, Marius, and kind of how you should think about it, in a large organization. Maybe you can talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, so most of the lead time, like when we've seen sort of setting this up in customers and getting it going, the majority of the time is just getting the necessary approvals internally to be able to stand up this, the system inside of behind your VPN, or if you're doing the cloud, then connecting, then it's good. You can stand it up in SaaS model, but then we have to connect it to your data sources, right? So that connectivity, getting the architecture and security team to sign off on, hey, I'm going to be able to pull this metadata, and getting the service accounts required to that can take time, and that varies a lot on organizations. There's some organizations that have a pretty streamlined process to do that, and they can get that done within a week or two. There are others that require a month or more of architectural review and various bodies to sign off on collection of metadata, right? So, and if you need to stand it up inside of your own cloud, then of course there's the work required to do that. So usually we would do like a POC. We that, I don't know, a month or something like that might be a reasonable amount of time for most organizations to get the software, install it, connect it to everything, run through this process, and then kind of evaluate and see the results, and then figure out, okay, this is generating enough value for me to move forward, check, or and so forth, right? So something in that order, but it really, again, it's going to vary. It's not the technical aspect, the collecting of the metadata. Even for very large instances where you have tens of thousands of reports, it's only going to take a few hours to pull the metadata. It's really just getting the approvals and installing the software and getting the approvals to get connected with the necessary accounts to pull that metadata that tends to be time consuming.
Good final call for any additional questions here. If not, thank you for joining us today. We're coming to the top of the hour, so we'll call it here. As we've been saying all along, this is kind of part of a series of generally governance-related topics that we're doing through the end of the year. Next one's going to be in early September, where I think kind of related to the last question a little bit, but how do you kind of get people involved in governance efforts in a productive way, where they want to participate and they want to help out with the general process. So we're going to be covering that in September. Hope you can join us for that. As we said up front, all these recordings are available on our YouTube channel at Metric Insights. But we'll also send out the links via the email. Thanks for your time, Marius, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all. Look forward to the next one with everyone.